The air in the grand library of the Vance estate on the Savannah riverfront always smelled of beeswax, old leather, and conditional love. For 18 years, Alexandra had lived as a statistical anomaly in her own home, living, breathing ledger error that her stepmother, Beatrice Vance, constantly sought to correct. On the day Alexandra returned from her initial Marine Corps training cycles, graduating at the absolute top of her class as the honor graduate for the grueling Scout-Reconnaissance pipeline, she didn't expect a banquet. But she hadn't expected a slaughter either. Beatrice sat behind a massive mahogany desk, her platinum blonde hair pinned back into a flawless, icy chignon. Her tailored Chanel suit didn't have a single crease. Beside her sat Charlotte, Alexandra's younger half-sister, smirk locked onto her face as she mindlessly swiped through a luxury fashion catalog on her iPad. Alexandra stood at attention, her crisp Marine Service alphas immaculate, holding a gold-embossed leather folder containing her leadership commendation and top-tier sniper reconnaissance certification. "Put it down," Beatrice said, not looking up from her corporate financial ledger. Alexandra stepped forward and placed the folder on the desk. Beatrice picked it up with 2 manicured fingers, as if handling a piece of contaminated medical waste. She flipped it open, glanced at the words "Summa Cum Late, United States Marine Corps Reconnaissance Training Command," and let out a dry, rattling laugh. "A scout?" Beatrice murmured, looking up with eyes like chipped flint. "You spent 6 months crawling through the swamps of Camp Lejeune to earn a piece of paper that pays less than our head groundskeeper makes in a month? You are a financial deficit to this family, Alexandra. A liability." "It's an elite combat qualification, ma'am," Alexandra replied, her voice low, even, and disciplined. "It is a joke," Beatrice snapped. She leaned forward, the mask of high society elegance slipping to reveal the ruthless corporate predator beneath. "Your biological father left a massive capital hole in the Vance Logistics portfolio when he died. I didn't feed you, clothe you, and send you to preparatory academies so you could play G.I. Jane in the mud. Your sole utility to this family is strategic leverage." Beatrice tossed the folder across the desk. It slid to a halt right in front of an industrial-grade paper shredder. "The board has already approved the preliminary terms," Beatrice continued smoothly, adjusting her diamond tennis bracelet. "Next month, you will sign a formal marriage contract with Harrison Sterling, the eldest son of the primary shareholder of Atlantic Shipping. That merger will inject $40 million of liquid capital into the Vance infrastructure. That is your purpose. That is your contract." Charlotte giggled from the couch. "Mom's right, Alex. Leave the boardrooms and the real power to me. I'm stepping into the executive vice presidency next quarter. Someone has to actually run the empire while you're out guarding fences at the edge of the map." Alexandra didn't blink. "I will not sign the contract, Beatrice." Beatrice's face contorted into something ugly. Without a word, she picked up Alexandra's honor graduate certificate, slid it directly into the feed slot of the heavy-duty shredder, and flicked the switch. The machine roared to life, its steel teeth violently tearing the gold-embossed document into thin, unreadable strips of white and gold confetti. "Then get out," Beatrice whispered over the mechanical grinding. "Walk out that door with nothing but the clothes on your back. Let's see how long your elite qualifications keep you alive when the Vance safety net is gone." The wrought iron gates of the Vance estate didn't slam shut behind Alexandra. They clicked with a heavy metallic finality that severed her from the only world she had ever known. It was 0200 hours. The coastal Georgia fog was rolling in thick and heavy off the salt marshes, turning the streetlights along the avenue into blurry amber halos. Alexandra stood on the edge of the highway, the midnight humidity clinging to her skin like a second uniform. She didn't have a wallet full of credit cards, a trust fund routing number, or a vehicle registered in her name. All she possessed was a weathered, faded olive-drab Alice Paca surplus military rucksack she had bought with her own meager training stipend and the steel in her spine. Inside the pack were 3 sets of utility uniforms, a pair of broken-in combat boots, a standard-issue Ka-Bar knife, and $42 in cash. Her sister's words echoed through her mind, a mocking, repetitive loop. Someone has to run the empire while you're out guarding fences. Alexandra tightened the nylon straps of her rucksack until the canvas bit deep into her shoulders, the physical pain a welcome distraction from the cold, hollow betrayal burning in her chest. She turned her back on the sprawling mansions of Savannah's elite and began to march down the shoulder of Highway 17. Every step she took away from that gilded cage was an act of war. She didn't walk with the hesitant gait of a cast-out runaway. She marched with the heavy, rhythmic cadence of an infantryman moving toward the assembly area. She had spent 18 years being told she was a transaction, a piece of collateral to be traded across a mahogany table to secure someone else's balance sheet. Beatrice thought that by cutting off her financial oxygen, Alexandra would come crawling back on her knees, ready to sign the marriage contract just to escape the poverty of the streets. But Beatrice had miscalculated the fundamental nature of the girl she had tried to break. Alexandra didn't fear the dark, she didn't fear the cold, and she certainly didn't fear the mud. The swamp didn't reject her. It felt like an old friend welcoming her back to the trenches. By sunrise, she reached the gray, concrete expanse of the local military processing terminal. As she stepped into the sterile, fluorescent-lit office, she pulled her enlistment extension paperwork from her pocket and placed it on the recruiter's desk. "Put me on the first transport to the contested corridors," Alexandra said, her eyes burning with an icy, dangerous clarity. "I'm done waiting." The Pacific Operational Theater didn't care about family dynasties or corporate mergers. It only cared about attrition. 2 years after walking away from Savannah, Corporal Alexandra Mercer was no longer the clean-cut honor graduate who had stood in Beatrice's library. The jungle and the salt spray of the contested littoral corridors had carved away any remaining traces of her civilian past. Her skin was darkened by the equatorial sun, mapped with faint, pale scars from jagged coral reefs and razor-sharp elephant grass. She lay prone in the thick, black mud of a mangrove swamp on a nameless island chain in the South China Sea. The water was waist-deep, brackish, and teeming with parasites. For 72 hours, her 4-man scout sniper team had been embedded in this hide site, monitoring a high-value maritime smuggling route used by state-sponsored paramilitary militias. The rain was a constant, deafening roar, turning the world into a monochrome landscape of gray and green. Alexandra's eyes were locked behind the optics of her Min-10 semi-automatic sniper system, her breathing so slow it barely disturbed the camouflage netting draped over her shoulders. "Target movement, 2 o'clock, her spotter, Sergeant Miller, whispered through the bone conduction headset. Through the scope, Alexandra watched a heavily armed coastal patrol boat cut through the choppy waves, its deck mounted with an unflagging 7mm heavy machine gun. These weren't regular military forces. They were deniable maritime raiders vultures operating in the gray zone of international conflict. A sudden, sharp pop echoed from the tree line 300 meters to their left, followed by the distinctive, terrifying hiss of an incoming mortar round. The militia wasn't just patrolling, they were sweeping the grid. The shell detonated 50 meters behind their position, sending a geyser of black mud, jagged shrapnel, and shattered mangrove roots into the air. The shock wave slammed into Alexandra's chest, forcing the air from her lungs, but her hand remained absolutely motionless on the rifle's pistol grip. A piece of flying wooden debris sliced open her left cheek, a thin stream of crimson mixing with the camouflage paint on her jaw. "We're burned, Alex," Miller muttered, his fingers already loosening the security straps on his sidearm. "Extraction point is 2 mics out, but the channel is swarming." "Hold your tracking," Alexandra commanded, her voice an unbreakable anchor in the chaos. "If we run now, the boat catches us in the open water. Wait for the turn." She adjusted her elevation turret by 2 clicks, compensating for the heavy crosswind tearing off the open ocean. She didn't have air support. She didn't have a quick reaction force. She was completely isolated in a contested corridor where a single mistake meant an unmarked grave in the mud. She squeezed the trigger, the suppressed report of her rifle swallowed by the crashing thunder of the surf. The true test of her soul didn't happen in the hidden trenches of the Pacific Islands, but in the narrow, choked waters of the Malacca Strait in the summer of 2022. The mission was designated as an unflagging Tier 1 maritime interdiction, but the intelligence layout had been compromised before the assets even left the staging base. Alexandra, recently promoted to sergeant, was commanding an armored reconnaissance boat, a sleek, heavily reinforced high-speed craft designed to slip through shallow coastal shoals. Her objective was to provide perimeter surveillance for a Navy SEAL element executing a high-risk boarding action on a suspected weapons freighter. At 23:45 hours, the sky exploded. A barrage of rocket-propelled grenades fired from hidden positions along the shoreline shoals tore through the darkness. The first round struck the bridge of Alexandra's craft, detonating with a blinding white-hot flash that completely vaporized their main satellite navigation array and internal communication matrix. The steering column violently jerked, sending the armored boat scraping hard against a hidden, jagged sandbar. "Comms are dark. Navigation is dead." Her helmsman screamed, coughing through the thick, acrid black smoke filling the small cabin. Through the shattered ballistic glass, Alexandra saw the nightmare unfolding 300 meters away. The Navy SEAL assault team's transport boat had taken a direct hit. It was stuck on a burning reef, engulfed in flames. A swarm of fast-attack rebel skiffs was closing in on them like a pack of wolves, their automatic weapons chewing the surrounding water into a frothing, bloody frenzy. The SEALs were pinned down, outgunned, and running out of deck space on a burning hull. "We're breaking hard left," Miller shouted, trying to force the jammed throttle back into reverse. "The engines are overheating, Alex. We have to pull back to deep water or we're going to ground." Alexandra looked at the burning reef, then looked at the navigation screen, which was throwing nothing but corrupted red error codes. They were blind, their technical advantage was gone, and the tactical manual dictated an immediate tactical withdrawal to prevent the loss of a second asset. "Negative," Alexandra said, her voice dropping into that terrifyingly calm, rhythmic bassline that her crew had learned to associate with absolute certainty. "Belay that order, Miller. We are not leaving them behind." She grabbed her M27 infantry automatic rifle, slammed a fresh magazine into the well, and stepped out onto the exposed, pitching deck of the armored boat directly into the crosshairs of the oncoming enemy. The wind off the strait screamed through her helmet as Alexandra locked her boots into the deck cleats. The world narrowed down to the front sight post of her weapon and the muzzle flashes of the rebel skiffs. The lead enemy boat, a modified fiberglass speed craft carrying 6 heavily armed maritime insurgents, cut inside their perimeter, aiming a heavy, vehicle-mounted machine gun directly at her engine bay. If that round connected, her boat would become a floating coffin. Alexandra didn't hesitate. She opened fire, her weapon spitting controlled, devastating 3-round bursts that ripped through the lead skiff's cockpit. The enemy driver collapsed over the wheel, causing the speed craft to veer violently off course and crash directly into a secondary rebel vessel at 40 knots. The resulting explosion illuminated the dark strait in a brilliant, fiery orange glare. "Bring us parallel to the burning reef." Alexandra roared over the deafening din of the firefight, her weapon hot enough to melt the salt spray hitting the barrel. "Lay down a continuous wall of suppression on that shoreline." With their navigation system fried, she had to rely entirely on raw, instinctual pilotage. She stood fully exposed on the gunwale, using hand signals to guide her helmsman through the treacherous, breaking surf, dodging coral heads by mere inches based on the color of the foam. They slammed against the side of the burning SEAL transport with a violent structural groan. "Get them aboard, now," Alexandra commanded, her arms working like pistons as she reached over the side, dragging wounded, oil-slicked operators out of the burning water and onto her deck, while simultaneously firing her weapon one-handed into the encroaching tree line. Shrapnel from an RPG detonation peppered the side of her helmet, the blunt force driving her to one knee, but she rose instantly, her eyes fixed on the remaining enemy skiffs. She didn't stop until all 8 surviving members of the extraction team were crammed into her cargo bay. With her hull taking on water and the starboard engines screaming in mechanical agony, Alexandra guided the battered, blood-stained reconnaissance boat away from the burning shallows, cutting through a gauntlet of small arms fire until they reached the dark, protective sanctuary of the open sea. 3 months later, inside a windowless, high-security briefing room at the Pentagon, a 4-star Marine general pinned the Navy Cross, the nation's second-highest military decoration for valor, onto Alexandra's uniform jacket. "Your actions in the Malacca Strait saved the lives of 8 specialized operators, Sergeant Mercer," the general said, his voice grave. "But because of the sensitive diplomatic nature of the contested corridor and the unacknowledged operations of the paramilitary group you engaged, this entire file is being locked behind a TSSCI compartmentalized firewall. No press releases. No public records. The world cannot know what you did out there." "Understood, sir," Alexandra replied, standing as straight and unyielding as a marble pillar. "The medal belongs to the unit. I just brought them home." When she received her consecutive shore duty orders back to the Savannah logistics sector, she returned not as a conquering hero, but as a ghost. To the public record, she was just an ordinary administrative border liaison, a generic customs specialist assigned to manage routine inventory manifests for the Regional Maritime Command. A week after her return, Beatrice Vance hosted a lavish fundraising gala at the Savannah Yacht Club. Alexandra attended only because her commanding officer had requested a military representative present for the civilian defense contractors. She wore her service uniform, the Navy Cross ribbon conspicuously absent from her chest due to the strict non-disclosure protocol governing her active file. As she walked near the docks, she ran into Beatrice and Charlotte, who were surrounded by a circle of wealthy shipping executives and local politicians. "Oh, look," Charlotte sneered, pointing a manicured finger at Alexandra's plain service dress. "The prodigal daughter has returned. Still wearing the same boring suit, I see. Did they finally give you a promotion, Alex, or are you still just a glorified security guard checking shipping crates at the border gates?" Beatrice smiled coldly, raising her glass of champagne to her guests. "Don't tease your sister, Charlotte. Someone has to do the menial, low-wage tasks that keep the country safe from cargo thieves. While you are preparing to take over a multi-billion-dollar boardroom, Alexandra is content being a low-tier gatekeeper. Every family needs a laborer, after all." The executives laughed politely, turning their backs on Alexandra to continue discussing Vance Logistics' record-breaking quarterly margins. Alexandra stood in the shadows of the dock, her face completely expressionless, her hands resting calmly at her sides. Beneath her uniform jacket, her pulse held a perfectly steady, unbreakable 60 beats per minute. They thought she was a broken runaway who had failed to make something of herself. They thought they were the ones who held the keys to power in this city. They had no idea that the silent gatekeeper they were mocking had just been handed absolute oversight authority by the Federal Procurement Committee to investigate their entire corporate empire. The storm was coming, and the Vance family had just insulated themselves with paper walls. The rain lashing against the reinforced structural glass arches of the Metropolitan Plaza in Atlanta did not sound like water. It sounded like high-velocity shrapnel hitting steel plating. Outside, the cityscape was a churning, violent cauldron of pitch-black rain and heavy fog. A volatile cold front had rolled in, generating an atmospheric pressure drop so severe that it left the air inside the grand building feeling unnaturally dense. But inside the executive conference wing, reality was static, artificial, and completely insulated by wealth. The air in the room was a suffocating canopy of $700 cologne, roasted garlic truffles, and the sharp, oily aroma of premium, aged scotch. A massive mahogany table anchored the center of the floor, its polished surface catching the dim glow of imported Italian chandeliers. "Tonight belonged to my stepmother, Beatrice Vance, and my biological father, Arthur Vance." It was a carefully curated public performance, a high-stakes corporate proxy coronation designed to convince the regional elite and the federal procurement delegates that Vance Global Logistics was an untouchable cornerstone of national security supply lines. And then, I breached the perimeter. I had arrived straight from a grueling 48-hour deployment corridor. My combat boots had left the vibrating metal deck of a naval transport vessel barely 3 hours ago. I was operating on nothing but bitter black commissary coffee, 2 protein bars that tasted like industrial drywall, and pure, clinical focus. I hadn't stopped to change into civilian attire or civilian-friendly manners. I stood in the grand entrance of the hall wearing my regulation tight, deep midnight blue United States Marine Corps dress uniform with the striking crimson piping running down the sleeve edges. But my uniform wasn't pristine for a gala. The cuffs were worn thin along the seams where the friction of a heavy ceramic plate carrier and utility web gear had ground into the wool for years. On my chest, rows of multicolored combat ribbons and the heavy silver frame of my decorations caught the light, but my boots, my heavy, mud-caked combat boots were. They carried a thin, jagged white crust of dried salt and dark, sulfurous marsh mud along the leather eyelets, dragged straight from a coastal deployment zone. My hair was scraped back into a brutal, tight regulation bun that left the skin around my temples pulled taut, creating a low, rhythmic throb directly behind my eyes. To the billionaires, defense brokers, and corporate lawyers mingling under the gold chandeliers, I didn't look like an invited guest or a family member. I looked like an administrative error that had bypassed the lobby security layout by mistake. The second my heavy rubber soles landed onto the pristine polished marble, the wet, sharp thud of my heels sliced cleanly through the low ambient music of the live string quartet. The social temperature in the room plummeted instantly. A cluster of logistics subcontractors in custom silk tuxedos froze mid-laugh, their eyes dropping to the dried gray mud flaking off my left heel before flickering upward with a collective expression of profound, upper-class disgust. "Good God, Alexandra!" A sharp, straight razor whisper hissed from the shadow of the reception archway. It was my stepmother, Beatrice Vance. She intercepted me before I could even clear the security scanners, her gown a cascading emerald silk masterpiece rustling like dead winter leaves against the stone floor. Her fingers, heavy with diamond rings that clicked aggressively against her manicured nails, clamped onto the worn fabric of my uniform sleeve with an unyielding territorial grip. She forcibly dragged me behind a structural marble pillar, desperate to isolate my presence from the high society crowd. "Look at you," Beatrice whispered, her face pale with an immediate, deep-seated rage, her eyes darting frantically across the rotunda to ensure the local county executives weren't watching the interaction. "You smell like marsh brine, jet fuel, and absolute common failure. Tonight is the coronation of your sister's entire corporate future. The senior acquisition directors from Washington are sitting at our table. And you march through the front entrance looking like an unwashed mechanic straight out of the trenches. Why must you always find a way to stain the family name?" Before I could invoke a single count of tactical breathing, the heavy velvet drapes near the inner gallery parted, and my younger half-sister, Charlotte Vance, stepped into the light. At 28, Charlotte was the immaculate puppet my stepmother had spent her entire adult life polishing. She possessed blonde hair that bounced with a synthetic perfect volume, and her chin was permanently anchored at that 45-degree angle of posture she had practiced since the day my father handed her the titles to our family's proxy shell companies. She held a crystal flute of vintage champagne between two slender fingers, her diamond tennis bracelets catching the harsh glare of the overhead lighting. She looked me up and down, the corner of her crimson lips curling into a cold smile of absolute satisfaction. "Leave her alone, Mother," Charlotte scoffed, her drawl dripping with a calculated, patronizing pity that was designed to draw blood in front of the surrounding staff. "What did you honestly expect from her? Alexandra has spent 15 years running away from real society to play soldier in the mud, and look where it landed her. She's 32, single, and living on a government paycheck that couldn't cover the import tax on my luxury handbag. She's nothing but a low-level clerk, stamping administrative manifests and inventorying boxes of office equipment under a flickering fluorescent bulb in some windowless room in Washington, while I am out here navigating capital acquisitions that dictate maritime defense structures. My older sister is checking serial numbers on rusty cargo containers." I pulled air deep into my lungs. 4 counts inhale, 4 counts hold, 4 counts exhale. My pulse remained locked at its baseline, 60 beats per minute. In the force reconnaissance corridors of my career, we were trained from day one. that psychological aggression from civilians was merely uncalibrated noise, the frantic, desperate thrashing of an adversary who doesn't understand the tactical map. I didn't drop my gaze. I looked straight through Charlotte's eyes, my face an expressionless pane of armor plating. The military transport was delayed by an automated security weather grid over the coast, Charlotte, I said, my voice low, flat, and completely devoid of turbulence. Happy anniversary to Father. Oh, stop with the ridiculous, rigid military posture, Alexandra. Charlotte snorted, her hand waving dismissively as she adjusted the diamond brooch pinned to her shoulder. Weather grid, please. You check logs and sign shipping slips. Let's look at structural reality. You're an administrative footnote with a clipboard. Your entire career is a multi-year family embarrassment that we quietly have to explain away to our neighbors at the country club. Oh, Alexandra is just doing stable government work, Mother tells them, so they don't ask why you're a broke bureaucrat while your sister is expanding the family dynasty. My biological father, Arthur Vance, emerged from the inner lounge, his chest puffed aggressively beneath his custom tuxedo. His face was a triumphant, jubilant purple from premium scotch and the heavy, intoxicating drug of corporate flattery. He walked with the heavy, unyielding stride of a man who believed his net worth gave him advisory authority over the entire global infrastructure. The moment his eyes dropped to my salt-crusted combat, his smile evaporated into pure disgust. "Get her into the private meeting hall, Beatrice," Arthur commanded, his nasal voice cutting through the ambient strings like a dull blade. He didn't offer a greeting. He didn't ask about the operations I'd been directing at sea. He stood there, his fists clenched inside his pockets, his jaw working silently around empty air. "I have the procurement board sitting at my table, Alexandra. I have spent 3 decades ensuring that the Vance name means prestige, wealth, and engineering excellence in Atlanta. I will not have my daughter standing here looking like a vagrant from a recruitment brochure. Look at your sister Charlotte. She just guaranteed a $10 million asset-backed line of credit for our logistics facility. That is what real power looks like. That is a return on investment." He took a step closer, his breath hot against my face. "I've already decided how our seating arrangement works tonight, and your worn clothes don't qualify for the main floor," my father said, his tone devoid of any human warmth. "We are going into the asset mediation room right now. Richard Lawson is waiting. We are going to settle the filial maintenance asset petition. I have spent thousands of dollars covering your childhood education, and now that Charlotte's LLC faces a minor federal compliance audit, it is time for you to hand over the title to your Savannah estate. You never used that land anyway. It's sitting there free of debt while your family infrastructure is under pressure. Sign the transfer papers tonight. Don't speak to the procurement delegates, and don't mention your government check to anyone under my roof. If your stubborn pride won't allow you to accept your place as a tool for this family's survival, then walk out those doors permanently. Take your scraps and never look back." Charlotte smiled behind her glass, a cold, vicious expression spreading across her face, as we turned toward the heavy mahogany doors of the mediation suite. "Go on, Alexandra," Charlotte whispered condescendingly. "Go sign the papers. Maybe if you're good, my company will let you audit some shipping logs at our warehouse next month. At least then you'd be useful." The transition from the grand entrance hall to the suffocating warmth of the private asset mediation suite took exactly 11 paces. I carried my legal folder over my left forearm like a weapon, my mud-crusted boots leaving wet tracks across the pristine hardwood floors as we walked into the center of the room. Richard Lawson, the family's corporate defense attorney, a man who had spent his entire career navigating capital loopholes with the supreme confidence of a corporate predator, leaned back in his leather executive chair, his fingers steepled, his eyes dragging over my uniform like he was sizing up a piece of discarded military surplus. "Let's look at the legal framework, Ms. Vance," Richard Lawson said, his tone dripping with a patronizing presentation meant to filter out any resistance. He tapped a heavy gold pen against a red-bordered asset ledger. "The petition for filial maintenance asset support is straightforward. Your parents have demonstrated a significant structural need due to ongoing federal procurement adjustments facing Vance Global Logistics. You hold a debt-free in Savannah and an active government salary. In the state of Georgia, family infrastructure requires mutual support. Your sister Charlotte's corporate footprint drives the true domestic defense logistics of this region. Your refusal to sign over the title to leverage her LLC is not just rigid, it's an act of unstable, cold sibling rivalry. Charlotte sat frozen in her leather throne at the right side of the table, her crystal glass catching the harsh glare of the recessed ceiling lights. She tilted her head, her smile thin and razor-sharp as she looked down her nose at my ribbons. "She's always been like this, Richard," Charlotte chuckled. Her voice carried across the mahogany surface with absolute certainty. "She thinks because she wears that uniform and logs cargo manifests for the Department of Defense, she's immune to family obligations. She doesn't understand that real asset power belongs to the elites who negotiate corporate contracts. She's hoarding a government salary while my logistics line is maintaining the actual infrastructure of the... She's an emotional inconvenience who won't face reality." My stepmother Beatrice slammed her hand onto the mahogany table, the diamond rings on her fingers rattling against the wood with a sharp, territorial clack. Tears perfectly timed. Manipulative tears welled in the corners of her eyes as she leaned forward, her chest tensing beneath her emerald silk gown. "You have spent 15 years in ungrateful exile, Alexandra," Beatrice shouted, her voice trembling with a calculated theatrical rage designed to enforce compliance. "We raised you under our roof, we gave you the Vance name, and the moment your sister needs your property to secure a federal banking guarantee, you turn into a cold, heartless military robot. Your father's company is facing an asset forfeiture tax lien because of federal bureaucracy. Sign the paper immediately. Pay the invoice for your 15 years of defiance, or I will personally ensure that every media outlet in Atlanta receives a copy of your personnel dispute thread. I will make sure your commanding officer knows exactly how unstable and vicious you are to your own blood." I sat perfectly motionless across the well of the table, my palms flat against the dark wood, my face in unreadable pain of polished armor plating. My heart rate remained locked at its baseline 60 beats per minute. I didn't interrupt her monologue. I didn't scream. I didn't reach for an excuse or a lawyer. I simply watched Beatrice and Charlotte walk straight into the center of the trap they had spent months constructing for me. "Are you finished with the presentation, Mr. Lawson?" I asked, my voice low, smooth, and entirely devoid of turbulence. Before Lawson could answer, the heavy double doors of the mediation suite burst open with a violent structural crash that rattled the glass panels along the interior wall. 4 fully armed federal operators in black tactical gear with the gold insignia of the Defense Oversight Command fanned out into the room, their boots striking the floor in an unbreakable parade cadence. They didn't look at my father. They didn't look at Charlotte. They took tactical positions blocking every exit, and walking through the center of the formation was federal oversight. Harold Sterling. He held a thick, heavily encrypted intelligence folder stamped with crimson security stencils, the definitive federal file marked Doc X. He marched straight past the plaintiff's podium, ignored Lawson's reaching hand, and stopped exactly 2 paces from my chair. He slowly removed his glasses, his face transitioning from a cold, judicial detachment to an absolute wide-eyed shock as his eyes locked onto my name tape and the silver oak leaves pinned to my collar. The silence that followed was a massive, vacuum-sealed force. Harold Sterling, a man who had spent 3 decades presiding over the highest federal procurement disputes in the country, slowly brought his heels together with a sharp, echoing crack. His posture snapped into a perfect vertical line, and he executed a flawless, deeply respectful regulation salute directly to me, leaving my father and sister completely frozen in their chairs. "Major Vance, ma'am," Sterling's voice boomed across the cedar-paneled room, steel on steel, entirely devoid of any civil hesitation. "The Federal Oversight Review under Security File Docs is live. The internal investigation regarding the Vance Global Logistics contracts has been completed. We are ready to proceed with your forensic audit, ma'am." At ease, I said, my voice cutting through the room's suffocating heat like cold iron. I reached across the table and activated the boardroom's encrypted projector link. A massive spreadsheet of verified federal banking data and corporate routing numbers filled the large digital display wall, completely tearing apart the narrative Lawson had spent 15 minutes presenting. "Let's the actual asset trail contained in Docs Pice," my legal representative, Commander Vance's special counsel, said as she stepped to the center of the floor. "The plaintiffs have painted Alexandra Vance as a selfish drain on the family's resources. But the numbers don't lie. In 2019, when Arthur Vance's logistics enterprise faced complete federal asset seizure due to an undisclosed asset forfeiture tax lien, it wasn't Charlotte who saved the corporation. It was Alexandra. She quietly wired $50,000 from her combat deployment hazard pay directly to the federal escrow agent to clear her father's liabilities without ever receiving a thank you text." My father's jaw dropped slowly, his face transitioning from a triumphant purple to a hollowed-out wet gray as he stared at his own corporate routing numbers on the screen. In 2022, the council continued her finger tracking down the blue lines of text when Charlotte Vance's LLC faced a civil fraud judgment in Ohio for misrepresenting equipment specifications. Alexandra siphoned $40,000 from her personal military commendation fund to settle the liabilities and keep her sister from a federal indictment. Alexandra has been the invisible infrastructure holding this family together for a decade, while Charlotte was utilizing her lifestyle as bait to hook defense investors at country clubs. "No," my stepmother Beatrice whispered, her voice cracking open as she looked at the dates on the screen. Her perfect, manipulative tears dried instantly on her pale cheeks. "Arthur, you told me Charlotte settled those balances through her partnerships. You said Alexandra was just a clerk who didn't possess a single asset." "The final audit is far worse, Mrs. Vance," I said, my voice dropping half an octave, becoming colder than the rain lashing against the windows outside. I looked directly at Charlotte, whose fingers were now trembling violently against her pearl necklace. "The $10 million defense subcontract you are trying to secure tonight using my Savannah property as collateral under DOC Acts has already been permanently flagged. The you contracted for the radar platforms were intercepted by my department at DIA 3 weeks ago. The commanding officer who signed the federal seizure warrant liquidated your corporate credentials and initiated the total blacklist of Vance Global Logistics is none other than Major Alexandra Vance." The room became an absolute vacuum. Lawyer Richard Lawson stared at the projector screen, his face losing color frame by frame until he looked like wet newsprint. He looked at the federal stamps on the warrant, then at the 4 armed operators standing at the door, then back at my silver oak leaves. He realized in one terrifying second that he was standing across the well from a Tier 1 Special Operations Officer and DIA Intelligence Director. Fearful of a federal perjury and conspiracy indictment, he quietly closed his briefcase, snapped the metallic latches shut with a sharp clack, and stepped back from the table. "Your Honor," Lawson said, his voice completely hollowed out, "I must formally withdraw my representation of the plaintiffs, effective immediately. I was not made aware of these material data falsifications." He didn't look at my father carried his briefcase and fled the room through the side exit, leaving my family entirely defenseless. The heavy double doors clicked open again, and 4 DCIS tactical agents stepped into the suite. Charlotte let out a wet, strangled rattle as her hands were forcefully pulled behind her back, the metallic snap of the handcuffs echoing off the high stone ceilings as she was stripped of her corporate credentials right on the witness floor. "Alexandra, please!" My father exploded, his voice breaking as his body collapsed heavily against the mahogany table. The supreme, patriarchal authority he had carried into this building turned into ash. "Call the Pentagon. Fix this family misunderstanding. Your sister didn't know there were counterfeits. She was under pressure." I stood up slowly, adjusted the brim of my regulation cap, and looked down my nose at the 3 parasites who had spent 15 years calling me a disappointment while bleeding my bank accounts dry in the dark. "I don't negotiate with traitors or corporate parasites, Father," I said, my voice iron on iron. "The final audit has arrived. Live with it." I turned on my heel. my heavy leather boots leaving a final dent in the pristine stone floor as I marched through the exit well into the clean, cold night air. 3 years later, inside the white marble atrium of the National Museum of the Marine Corps, I walked beneath the shadow of a retired tactical aircraft, my hand locked gently around the warm fingers of Charlotte's abandoned daughter, whom I had successfully rescued from the wreckage of their dynasty. A clean, beautiful, and absolute victory. The sterile, fluorescent lighting of the high-security federal hearing room in Savannah felt like a cold knife slicing through the remnants of the morning's high society illusions. On the left side of the mahogany aisle sat Beatrice Vance, draped in pristine Armani, her face a mask of patronizing boredom. Beside her, Charlotte Vance mindlessly adjusted a diamond hair clip, leaning over to whisper to her legal team about their upcoming flight to Miami. At the center of the bench sat federal judge Marcus Bennett, a legendary jurist known across the Eastern Seaboard for his unyielding enforcement of defense procurement laws and his oversight of multi-billion-dollar military supply contracts. "Let's expedite this, Your Honor," the Vance family's lead counsel said, sliding a thick folder toward the center aisle. "We have an unexecuted property deed for Sergeant Alexandra Vance's ancestral horse farm. It is required as immediate collateral to stabilize Vance Global's microchip procurement tender for the Navy's regional fleet. The defendant is a low-tier administrative customs liaison who is deliberately stalling a national security pipeline due to an internal family grievance." And Judge Bennett didn't look at the lawyer. His focus was pinned to the tactical, heavily encrypted federal tablet embedded into his bench. A highly restricted file with a deceptive, bare-bones designation had just bypassed his primary firewalls. Operation Nuskirmielzi, Cooperation, Mino Kadbautiv, New Kadavenix. As the judge's biometric thumbprint initiated the triple-layer cryptographic decryption, the document unspooled. The courtroom went dead silent as Judge Bennett's posture suddenly went entirely rigid. The calm, magisterial authority on his face collapsed, replaced by a sudden, deathly paleness. His eyes widened, darting across the secured data lines, tracking the operational security clearances, the classified service records, and the true identity tied to the digital signature buried deep within the metadata. Name: Alexandra Vance. Rank: Major, United States Marine Corps. Callsign: Phoenix 01. Status: Special Liaison to the Defense Intelligence Agency, DIA, and Director of High-Risk Procurement Audit. The sergeant insignia on her shoulders wasn't her rank, it was her active operational cover while dismantling a compromised domestic defense network. Beatrice chuckled softly under her breath, leaning toward Charlotte. "Look at the judge. He's disgusted by her insubordination. It's over." They didn't see that Judge Bennett's hands were visibly shaking. "Your Honor," the Vance counsel prompted, his voice oozing a polite but patronizing impatience. "Should we present the property deed for Sergeant Vance's signature now?" Judge Bennett didn't answer the lawyer. Instead, he slowly pushed his high-backed leather chair away from the bench. His gaze locked onto Alexandra, who sat perfectly still at the defense table, her posture rigid, her hands resting calmly on the wood, her pulse holding an unbreakable 60 beats per minute. The judge stood up. It wasn't the standard movement of a magistrate commanding a room. It was the sharp, instinctual reaction of a man confronted by a living legend. Before the paralyzed gaze of the entire room, the 62-year-old federal judge stepped down from the elevated bench. He didn't look at Beatrice. He didn't look at the corporate lawyers. He walked directly to the defense table, stopped exactly 2 paces from Alexandra, and brought his right hand up to his brow in a crisp, flawlessly executed military salute. His arm trembled slightly with an overwhelming surge of raw, unadulterated emotion. "Major Vance." Judge Bennett's voice cracked thick with a profound, unspoken reverence that sent a violent shockwave through the room. "This court, and my entire family, stand forever in your debt." "What? What is the meaning of this?" Beatrice stammered, leaping to her feet, her face flushing crimson. "Your Honor, she is a sergeant, a rogue border clerk. Why are you saluting her?" "Shut your mouth, Beatrice," Judge Bennett roared, turning a gaze of pure fury upon the older woman. The judge's voice echoed off the wood-paneled walls like thunder. "You stand in the presence of the officer who commanded the extraction at the Malacca Strait in 2022. You stand in front of Phoenix 01. Sterling turned back to Alexandra, his eyes glistening with tears. "My only son, Lieutenant Marcus Bennett Jr., was the commander of the Marine Recon platoon that was cut off on that burning sandbar. They were marked as acceptable casualties by the regional command. They were left to die. It was this woman, this major, who took an unnavigable boat through a gauntlet of maritime militia, fought off 2 enemy gunboats single-handed, and dragged my son out of the fire." The room fell into a terrifying, dead silence. Charlotte's mouth dropped open, her designer arrogance evaporating instantly. Beatrice clutched the edge of the table so tightly her knuckles turned white, her eyes darting from the saluting judge to her stepdaughter, who hadn't even shifted her posture. "At ease, Judge Bennett," Alexandra said softly. Her voice wasn't loud, but it possessed a terrifying, absolute authority that commanded the room. "Please resume your bench. The financial audit is ready to commence. The defense is ready to present the financial and criminal evidence regarding the plaintiff's systemic fraud," announced Captain Vance's legal representative, stepping forward and opening a military-grade secure laptop. With a single keystroke, the massive projector screens on the wall flickered to life. A vast, intricate web of financial transactions, tax records, and wire transfers illuminated the dim room, bathed in a cold blue light. "Let the record show," the military prosecutor spoke with rhythmic, devastating clarity, "that the narrative of Alexandra Vance being an ungrateful, broke liability to the Vance family is a carefully fabricated corporate myth used to psychologically leverage her assets." The first document flashed on the screen, Internal Revenue Service, Notice of Levy and Tax Lien. In October of 2019, the prosecutor stated, pointing to the encrypted data fields, "Vance Global Logistics faced a catastrophic federal tax evasion charge. The late Mr. Jott, Vance's assets were under a complete federal asset forfeiture freeze, which would have bankrupted the family empire before it began. The individual who saved him from ruin was not his business partners, nor his youngest daughter, Charlotte. It was Alexandra Vance." The screen zoomed in on a wire transfer originating from a specialized military banking institution. Major Vance utilized her cumulative hazard pay and combat deployment bonuses earned while taking shrapnel in clandestine maritime corridors to secretly execute an anonymous structural bailout. She paid the $50,000. She lifted the freeze on her father's estate, and she never said a word, allowing Beatrice to believe it was a banking error. Beatrice's face drained of color. She looked at the screen, her lips trembling. "No, that can't be. My husband told me he settled that." "Your husband didn't have the capital, ma'am," the prosecutor corrected coldly, transitioning to the next slide. "Stati Officio v. Charlotte Vance. Fraudulent e-France fraud e-escrow and securities spies-alation, 2022. 2 years later, the prosecutor continued, his voice dripping with professional disdain. "Charlotte Vance engaged in a predatory real estate scam in Columbus, Ohio, resulting in a court-ordered asset forfeiture and a massive civil fraud penalty. To prevent a public scandal that would destroy Vance Global's defense bidding status, Major Vance authorized a blind disbursement from her military honor trust fund. She covered the penalty. She bought your silence, Charlotte. She bought your freedom." Charlotte sat paralyzed, her eyes pinned to her own signature on the Ohio court settlement. Next to the routing numbers of the trust fund she had just claimed, Alexandra was uselessly begging for crumbs from. The lead corporate attorney for Vance Global desperately tried to salvage his position, his voice rising in panic. "Your Honor, this is a domestic dispute. It has no bearing on the validity of the current defense procurement contract. Vance Global is offering Major Vance's horse farm as collateral to secure the fleet microchip tender. The business is sound. The business is a criminal enterprise." Alexandra spoke. She stood up. The silence that followed her movement was absolute. She tapped her terminal screen and the document Operation All Zeros, PH Phoenix Malacca. Doc X executed its terminal command sequence across the Federal Defense Network. The horse farm you have spent the last 3 hours attempting to extort from me, Alexandra said, looking directly into Charlotte's panicked eyes, was intended to be used as collateral for your new supply contract with the Department of Defense, a contract to supply military-grade microchips for the next-generation Navy fleet. She leaned forward, placing both hands flat on the table. 3 weeks ago, the Defense Intelligence Agency, DIA, and the Defense Criminal Investigative Service, DCIS, intercepted a shipment at the port of Savannah. The microchips your company, Vance Global, imported from a black market supplier in Eastern Europe were not aerospace-grade semiconductors. They were cheap, structurally flawed counterfeits chips that would fail under electromagnetic stress, blinding our Navy ships in an active combat zone. Beatrice choked on her own breath, her hand shaking violently as she gripped her designer purse. That's a logistical mistake, an unverified subcontractor. You signed the verification manifest yourself, Beatrice, Alexandra whispered, her voice a chilling promise of doom. And Charlotte authorized the payment to the shell company in the Cayman Islands. On the massive projector screen, the docs file executed its final, irreversible macro. The word terminated appeared in massive, blood-red block letters across the Vance Global Logistics corporate profile. Directly beneath it, an automated network command line began to scroll at lightning speed. DIA command. Freezy wall niterwalks leash user OC niterwalks as Renchen 601 nitero Vance. Pentagon logistics. Revoke here procurement. ZUS. Stast 5. Immediately. Federal Reserve. Seizdos counts Vance Global Logistics. The document docs isn't just an audit report, Beatrice, Alexandra said, her eyes flashing with the cold brilliance of a supernova. It is an automated, top-tier executive warrant. As of exactly 60 seconds ago, your corporate network has been completely severed from the United States military infrastructure. Your bank accounts are frozen. Your assets are seized by the federal government, and Vance Global Logistics is officially dead. The heavy oak doors of the hearing room flew open. 6 federal marshals, flanked by specialized agents from the Defense Criminal Investigative Service in tactical vests, poured into the room, cuffs drawn. Alexandra checked her watch one last time. Her heart rate was still a perfectly steady, unyielding 60 beats per minute. The trap was sprung, and the parasites had no escape. The sharp, metallic clinking of federal handcuffs echoed through the high-security chamber, sounding like structural rivets snapping on a sinking ship. For Corporate Attorney Lawson, the sound was a clear message. The game was over, and the house had lost. He didn't look at Beatrice. He didn't offer a single word of comfort to Charlotte. His analytical mind, honed by decades of exploiting legal loopholes, was already calculating the minimum federal prison sentence for misprision of treason and Grade 1 defense procurement fraud. With frantic, uncoordinated movements, Lawson slammed his briefcase shut, the locks clicking open and closed under his trembling fingers. He dropped his expensive Mont Blanc pen onto the floor, allowing it to roll into a puddle of spilled water without a second glance. "Your Honor," Lawson shouted, his voice cracking with panic as he backed away from the Vance family table, his hands raised high in front of the armed federal marshals. "Let the record show that Lawson & Associates formally withdraws as legal counsel for Vance Global Logistics, effective immediately. My firm was completely insulated from the technical procurement data. We were presented with falsified compliance documents by Charlotte Vance regarding the aerospace semiconductor microchips." "Lawson, you coward!" Charlotte shrieked, her voice morphing into a ragged, desperate wail as a female marshal grabbed her wrists, forcing her arms behind her back. "You set up the offshore routing systems. You took a 8% cut of the global fleet supply allocation. I took a legal retainer for standard corporate structuring." Lawson shot back, his face completely pale as he slipped through the side exit door, eager to run into the arms of the Department of Justice to secure a plea deal before the day was out. With their legal shield gone, the reality of absolute destruction broke over the Vance family. Charlotte, whose entire life had been an endless parade of designer dresses and corporate vanity, completely disintegrated. Her knees gave out beneath her. She collapsed heavily onto the polished mahogany floor, her expensive gown twisting around her legs as the white tablecloth was dragged down with her, sending crystal glasses and silverware shattering onto the floor. "Get them off me," Charlotte sobbed, her manicured nails clawing at the sterile tiles as she looked up at her older sister. "Alex, please, tell them it's a mistake. You're just a customs clerk." "You can't let them take me." Beatrice and Thomas Vance stood frozen at the table looking like statues carved from ash. The child they had cast aside as a financial liability, the daughter they had mocked as a mud crawler, was standing at the eye of the storm. She wasn't a victim begging for their acceptance. She was a major in the United States Marine Corps and a division chief for the Defense Intelligence Agency. She held the absolute key to their survival, and she had just turned it in the lock. "Alexandra, look at me!" Beatrice wailed, dropping to her knees in the middle of the shattered glass and spilled water. The perfect icy chignon she had worn for decades was frayed, strands of blonde hair clinging to her tear-streaked face. She reached out, her diamond-encrusted fingers stopping mere inches from Alexandra's scuffed black combat boots. "I am your mother. I raised you," Beatrice cried, her voice echoing off the wood-paneled walls. "You have the intelligence clearances. You have the authority. Just make one phone call to the Pentagon. Call the undersecretary. Tell them there was a technical glitch with the microchip shipment. We can replace them. We will give you the horse farm, the riverfront estate, everything. Just save your sister from a federal penitentiary." Alexandra stood perfectly straight, her silhouette framed by the harsh blue light of the federal projector screens displaying the word "terminated" across the Vance global infrastructure. She didn't flinch. She didn't look down with anger or regret. Her pulse held an unbreakable, steady 60 beats per minute. Slowly, deliberately, Alexandra reached up with her left hand, adjusting the alignment of her service cap. The gold-braided eagle and anchor emblem glinted under the fluorescent lights, casting a sharp shadow over her icy, focused eyes. "I don't negotiate with parasites in tailored suits, Beatrice," Alexandra said, her voice dropping into a low, resonant register that cut through Charlotte's hysterical sobbing. "When I was bleeding on a steel table in Germany after an IED blast in 2018, you didn't call the hospital to check on my survival," Alexandra continued, her words falling like iron weights. "You called my legal representatives to demand a power of attorney transfer because you were worried my death would freeze your corporate credit line. You have spent 15 years living on the hazard pay of the soldier you despised while buying yachts with the money you made by trading counterfeit components that would blind our fleet in a combat zone." "Alex, please," Charlotte screamed as the marshals lifted her off the floor, the steel handcuffs biting into her wrists. "We're blood. Blood is a biological component, Charlotte," Alexandra whispered, turning her back on them with absolute finality. "It is not a blank check for treason. The invoice for your arrogance has finally come due. Live with your choices." From the shadows near the security perimeter, a tall, broad-shouldered man stepped forward. He didn't wear a uniform or a designer suit. He wore a simple charcoal jacket and heavy work boots, his hands calloused from his years as a Savannah firefighter. This was Daniel. He reached out, his massive, warm hand securely locking into Alexandra's fingers, providing the quiet, unyielding anchor he had maintained for years. "Objective secured, Major?" Daniel asked softly. Alexandra looked up at her husband, the cold mask of Phoenix 01 softening into a genuine, peaceful smile. "The area is clear, Daniel. Let's go home." Together, hand in hand, they walked out of the high-security terminal, leaving the screaming remnants of the Vance dynasty behind them, as the federal doors sealed shut for good. The fallout from the federal asset forfeiture was swift, total, and completely public. Within months of the hearing, the Vance global logistics empire was entirely dismantled by the Defense Criminal Investigative Service. The prestigious riverfront properties and ancestral estates were auctioned off by the U.S. Marshals Service to pay off the massive federal procurement fines, leaving Beatrice and Thomas completely destitute, isolated in a small rented apartment on the fringes of the state, ignored by the high society they had once ruled. In the federal correctional facility in West Virginia, Charlotte Vance sat in a gray jumpsuit, her designer lifestyle reduced to a memory. Her shallow husband, a socialite who had married her solely for her corporate access, filed for divorce within 90 days of her sentencing. He abandoned their infant daughter, Chloe, leaving her to the state foster care system rather than allowing a public scandal to stain his own financial portfolio. They had built a kingdom out of paper, completely unaware that Alexandra had been charting their destruction from the moment they tried to shred her honor. 3 years passed. The name Vance Global Logistics had been completely scrubbed from the military supply grid, replaced by a highly efficient, transparent semiconductor distribution network managed directly by the Strategic Air Command. In Triangle, Virginia, the morning sun broke through the coastal clouds, casting long, brilliant rays of light through the massive glass pavilion of the National Museum of the Marine Corps. The open exhibition hall was peaceful during the early hours, the air filled with the quiet, historic reverence of humanity's greatest tactical aviation achievements. Walking through the central gallery completely detached from the weight of military uniforms or intelligence metrics was Alexandra. She wore an elegant, tailored cream coat over a dark casual dress, her long hair pinned up in a sophisticated style that left her face clear and radiant. The permanent, defensive tension that had defined her features during her 15 years of cover was completely gone. She looked lighter, younger, as if the heavy gravity of her past had been entirely neutralized. Holding her left hand was Daniel, his presence as steady and reassuring as it had always been. But it was the little girl holding Alexandra's right hand that drew her focus. This was Chloe, Charlotte's daughter. When the family collapsed and Chloe was abandoned, Alexandra didn't hesitate. She utilized her legal team and personal resources to initiate an emergency adoption, pulling her niece out of the wreckage of the Vance legacy. She had ensured that the toxic cycle of parasitic vanity would end with the previous generation. "Look, Auntie Alex," Chloe chirped, her small finger pointing up at the massive olive-drab fleet transport helicopter suspended from the ceiling above them. "It looks like a giant green dragon." Alexandra stopped, looking up at the historic aircraft hanging in the exhibition bay. It was a machine built to operate in high-risk zones, taking hits and pushing through the smoke to bring soldiers home from the edge of the world. It was a sanctuary of steel. "That's a very brave plane, Chloe," Alexandra said softly, kneeling down so she was at eye level with the 3-year-old girl, gently brushing a stray curl away from her forehead. "It's designed to fly through the roughest storms without making a sound, just to make sure the people who are lost can find their way back. Is it safe now?" Chloe asked, her big, innocent eyes looking into Alexandra's face. "It's completely safe," Daniel said with a warm smile, lifting Chloe up onto his shoulder so she could look down into the cockpit canopy. "Because the storm is over." Alexandra stood up, her hand sliding back into Daniel's grip. She checked her watch out of old habit, but the metric was no longer a tactical baseline. Her pulse was a calm, natural 60 beats per minute, driven not by the discipline of combat, but by the absolute fulfillment of a peaceful life. The family that had tried to trade her soul was gone, their paper kingdom turned to dust. She had survived the mud of the trenches, the fire of the Malacca Strait, and the betrayal of her own blood emerging not as a weapon, but as a mother and a protector who had defined her own terms of victory. As they walked together toward the grand exit of the museum, stepping out into the bright, open warmth of the Virginia sun, Alexandra didn't look back. She was Alexandra Vance. She was Phoenix 01, and she was, at long last, completely, proudly, and absolutely free.
Every story teaches us something. Today's lesson is simple. Never judge someone's value by where they started. Judge them by what they overcame. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this story, please like, subscribe, and share your thoughts in the comments. See you in the next story.